The ethics of parenting is controversial, and the ethics of eating is controversial. So when you put the two together, things can get pretty controversial. But in this episode, we'll try and use reason and philosophy to navigate these difficult waters, asking, what should parents feed their kids? Should they be feeding kids an omnivorous diet involving meat and other animal products? Or is there a case parents should be feeding their kids a mainly or wholly plant-based diet? Hello, and thank you so much for tuning in to Surprising Ethics, the podcast where there's always a surprising idea from ethics or political philosophy unpacked for you in every single episode. I've got a great conversation for you today, featuring two philosophers who suggest quite big changes to the status quo about kids eating. But their argument is not of the usual type. They offer a structurally very different sort of argument against society's norms. And our conversation covers health and nutrition, autonomy, kids' moral development, the idea of imposing values on children, parents' rights, the social barriers to eating differently, teasing, peer pressure, and kids' desire to fit in, the value of cultural foods, emotions, and food, how to talk to kids about difficult and weighty ethical issues, and much more. Not only that, we have a special Put It to the Parent segment towards the end. 6 parents have very kindly agreed to be flies on the wall during this conversation, and the arguments will be put to the test with them to see how these ethical arguments apply in real life. I'm your host, William Gilday, a researcher in philosophy, and I'd like to thank the Centre for Research in Ethics, an academic research centre based in Montreal, for their very kind support of this podcast. So to get into it, as always on Surprising Ethics, we begin with the status quo position before looking at the surprising argument to the contrary, and then we ask how the status quo might fight back. So what is the status quo? I think the status quo says parents can pretty much feed their kids whatever they want, so long as they offer a diet that passes as minimally well-balanced, minimally healthy. According to the status quo, there is certainly no duty to feed kids a vegan diet. And on the contrary, the idea of feeding kids a vegan diet is met with more suspicion, ethically speaking, than the idea of feeding kids a meaty diet. So to illustrate this, here's a snippet from the TV show Good Morning Britain.
So Jane, let's start with you. You are vegan.
I am, yes.
But you've decided not to bring your children up as vegan.
No, I don't want to put my views on my children. I don't think you should put your religious, dietary or political views on your children. I think we have children to guide them to their own destination, not my destination. I want them to be able to go to parties and not have to think about serious things until they're ready. And when they're ready, I will tell them the absolute truth, and then they can make their own decision.
Okay, now we move to the very surprising alternative idea and arguments underpinning it. And the discussion is based on a new article in a top philosophy journal written by Fischer Fredericks and Jeremy Fisher. And until recently, Fredericks and Fisher were tenured academics working in the US in Ball State University and the University of Alabama in Huntsville, respectively. And they took the choice to leave academic employment and they continue their work as independent scholars. And so coming down the line now from Chicago, here they are, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. So most kids are raised to eat meat, and vegan kids are pretty rare. But you argue that parents, at least in richer countries, have a duty to feed their kids a plant-based diet. So what are the kind of specific reasons why parents should feed their kids a vegan diet? What kind of arguments do you provide for that view?
We give 3 kinds of reasons, but I'd like to just take a step back, and we understand that there are all kinds of real-world constraints that parents face. And so our thesis, our main claim, is that parents should give a maximally plant-based diet to their kids, acknowledging that sometimes you're not in the vicinity of a restaurant that has a good option, or you send kids to school that doesn't serve a plant-based meal, or So we understand there are real world constraints. We're really hoping that parents will take seriously the idea that there are incremental improvements that they can make. So our thesis is they really should do the most that they can reasonably do. So that said, we think there are three kinds of reasons that are just based in common sense parenting principles. So one is that parents have obligations to look after their kids' health and their physical development. The second is that parents have general responsibility to look after their kids' moral development and not corrupt their kids morally, to put it old-fashioned. And third, to help their kids develop their autonomy. It's the way that philosophers might put it, but to help kids think for themselves, to help kids develop abilities to make up their own minds as they grow up. So we think in these three kinds of reasons, combined with all kinds of surprising recent scientific research, suggests that the maximal plant-based principle is the way to best protect kids' interests overall. That's the high-level summary.
Great, thank you. So I think one maybe initial surprise for people will be the kind of view that vegan diets are not only perfectly fine for kids, but healthier for kids than other diets. And so what would you say to someone who thinks, look, surely it's kind of risky or dangerous to feed a kid a plant-based diet? Aren't there kind of specific vitamins or minerals that kids can't necessarily get easily on a plant-based diet, like omega-3 or vitamin D or calcium?
Yeah, of course, we're very sympathetic to any caregiver, not just parents, but any kind of caregiver who's responsible for providing food to kids. Of course, they're going to be concerned about doing what's best for those kids, and it's not always clear what that would be, especially in the nutritional realm, where things are very complicated. There's a kind of, I might say, a bias that, oh, well, whatever I ate growing up, it must be good enough because here I am. Like, a lot of people think this way. There's just kind of a status quo bias that, well, what I'm familiar with, that must be good enough. It must be reasonable to go with what I'm familiar with. So I'm sympathetic to that kind of thinking. I think we all do it in many areas of life all the time. But when it comes to nutrition, we know that the current standard American diet, which is heavy in meat and dairy and other animal products, heavy in processed foods and low in fruits and vegetables, we know that this diet is in fact deadly. And when we teach kids from a young age that this is an okay way to eat, we set them up for lots of health problems, not just in childhood, but over the course of their entire life, including heart problems, which is the biggest killer in America, but also many kinds of cancers, diabetes, and there's lots and lots and lots of research over decades showing that the standard American diet does not help us on these metrics. It's really taking us in a bad direction, and I think a lot of people recognize that. There's a lot of controversy in the nutritionist community about the exact precise amounts of specific nutrients that are necessary at specific ages. But when we look at overall dietary patterns, so a dietary pattern like plant-based eating or the Mediterranean diet or the standard American diet, when we look at that over a period of decades, a lifetime, it's actually very clear which are the healthier patterns.
Right.
And it's true that for a plant-based diet, depending on where you're living and what kinds of foods you have access to, fortification might be important, like having vitamin D fortified foods. You know, in the U.S., milk is fortified with vitamin D, animal milk. So it's not that milk itself is such an important source of vitamin D. It's that milk in the U.S. is fortified. And plant-based milks can also be fortified in the exact same way. So with things like vitamin D, there's not necessarily a reason to favor one over the other. Similarly, in the US, salt is iodized, and so there are very few problems relating to iodine deficiency in the US because people get it through their salt. Certainly, we know that the standard American diet is not doing anyone any favors health-wise, and we know that plant-based diets overall have the potential to save us a lot of heartache.
Yeah, and I think in the UK, I think the medical professionals suggest that everyone takes vitamin D supplements because it's kind of a vitamin you get through sun exposure, really, and there isn't enough sun in the UK. So I guess supplementation is meant to be part of a healthy diet for anyone, at least in some contexts. I take the point about the standard American diet. I think just looked up some figures before the call, and apparently in the US, according to the CDC, 20% of kids already suffer from obesity, and the figure's the same in the UK according to the NHS. And then for adults, it's 40% with obesity in the US, and 74% of people seem to be overweight in the US. So I guess there is a kind of huge health problem just in terms of obesity, right? And then I take the point that feeding people fruits, vegetables, lentils, nuts, seeds, legumes, beans, tofu, herbs, spices, you could go further wrong than doing that, given that I think some of this is driven by a kind of lack of exposure to fruit and veg and a kind of poor food environment, right?
Right. Yeah, I just want to echo what Rachel's saying about the food infrastructure and fortification. Examples that she gave are massive public health achievements of the 20th century, and they are not essentially tied to meat-eating diets. And then also just to echo what Rachel's saying about the big picture, heart disease is a major killer in the U.S., and it's underappreciated, even though it's the number one killer by far. Some 680,000 Americans die from heart disease, and this disease is mostly preventable. Diabetes causes a large amount of mortality and morbidity. There is a consensus to move away from the standard American diet. 9 or 10% of kids only meet the recommended servings of fruits and vegetables each day. So more than 90% of kids aren't getting fruits and veggies. So I think as a first step towards implementing what we're trying to convince people of is we can all agree that kids should be eating more fruits and vegetables. And as we go in that direction, we can also improve the infrastructure issues related to fortification and things like that. So that doesn't fully get to your question, but that's the way we would start to approach it.
Yeah. I was doing a quick check, and I think it's often the case that plant milks are already fortified with vitamin D. Obviously, people should probably check the package, but I think it's already happening, yeah.
Yeah, the majority of plant-based milks in the U.S. are being fortified now. That wasn't always the case in the past. There was a time when laws did not allow plant-based milks to be fortified to the same degree that animal milks are. That has changed, so that's a positive step. Similarly, just very recently, on January 14th, a new law came into effect in the U.S. that allows schools participating in the National School Lunch Program to offer plant-based milks that are fortified to be nutritionally equivalent to animal milks, to offer those to all students in schools. Previously, there was laws against that, and very narrow exceptions that were basically inaccessible to everyone, including the majority of children of color who are lactose intolerant. So this new law is a big deal. The law allows schools to offer plant-based milks. It does not require them to offer plant-based milks. So parents and other community members could make a case to their local school district that they want that and help implement this law more widely. But that's another step in the right direction.
I'll just add one thing. Yeah. It's important to acknowledge that there's a public panic in the U.S. and maybe in other countries about the need to eat ever more meat and ever more protein, and the dangers associated with eating whole food plant-based diet. When we visit family or friends, sometimes they'll ask with a genuine worried look on their face, like, how do you get enough protein? Are you in danger of not getting enough calcium? What about vitamin B12? There are PR marketing campaigns to convince people to eat ever more animal products and to inspire a kind of panic. There are no hospital wings devoted to rescuing vegans and vegetarians and their ailments. There are hospital wings tied to rescuing people with heart disease, and animal products are a main cause of heart disease. That said, of course, attention needs to be paid to planning kids' diets, and that goes for all parents and all caregivers. It's really important. But our main claim is that there are strong reasons to think that concern for kids' health favors the plant-based diet rather than the status quo or the meat-heavy status quo. And we want people to ask themselves why they think meat-heavy diets are the safe course of action for kids. The meat-heavy diet seems to be quite dangerous in some respects.
Hi there, it's Will here doing last-minute edits. The parents made me realise we didn't really include many quotes directly from dietitians. So here's a bit more of that, starting with dietitian Dr. Michael Greger.
There's two vitamins that aren't made by plants. One's vitamin D, which is made by animals such as yourself. When you walk outside, it's the sunshine vitamin. And the other one's vitamin B12, not made by plants, not made by animals either, made by little microbes that blanket the earth. So, we could get all the B12 we needed drinking out of, well water, a mountain stream or something a long time ago. But now we chlorinate our water supply, kill off any bacteria. But because of that, we need to get a regular, reliable source of B12, critically important, particularly for pregnant women, but for everybody. Should we raise our kids healthy? I say yes, indeed. So does the most esteemed pediatrician in human history, Dr. Benjamin Spock, in the 7th edition of Child and Baby Care, which is like one of the best-selling books ever, where in his last edition, he wrote in his 90s before he died, recommended that all children be raised with zero exposure to meat and dairy. he did that because he could see what the grandparents were dying from, see this burgeoning childhood obesity epidemic. And so, ADA, what's now the Academy of Nutrition Dietetics, in their official position paper says, strictly plant-based diets are appropriate for all stages of the lifestyle, including pregnancy and infancy and on through old age.
And then I thought I'd look up the UK national dietary body, the British Dietetic Association, which is the only body that represents the whole dietetic workforce. So to quote their official position, plant-based diets can support healthy living at every age and life stage. But as with any diet, you should plan your plant-based eating to meet your nutritional needs. Your argument kind of comprises 3 prongs, right, which kind of together, you think, ground this duty, which can be overridden by other considerations, this duty to raise kids vegan and to provide them with kind of appropriate education about why people choose to be vegan or why people choose to eat meat. So the second prong is about autonomy. And I think, again, that will be surprising to people. People will think, how can autonomy or the ability to craft your own values and act in accordance with them and to act for your own reasons be furthered by kind of restricting your diet down to a small subset of foods? But you argue that actually the plant-based upbringing is the best way to enhance autonomy and people's ability to choose for themselves, whatever option they want to choose. So could you maybe unpack that prong of the argument for listeners?
Yeah, thank you for emphasizing that these 3 prongs work together. We think that probably on their own, none of the prongs would be decisive, but we do think that when all 3 are brought together, the evidence is enough for us to have the best reason to shift in the plant-based direction. Now, on the autonomy question in particular, I'll start with maybe a very simplified way of talking about it, and maybe Jeremy will want to chime in with some more details in a moment. But to return to the analogy with smoking cessation versus smoking prevention efforts for just a moment, no one would suggest that we give all 8-year-olds cigarettes so that they can make an informed decision for themselves about whether to be smokers.
Right.
There are some things that we don't give kids because their preferences are just forming, and it's our duty as caregivers to help them shape their own preferences and their knowledge base in a way that will serve them long term, regardless of what they decide is most important to them, right? We wouldn't give cigarettes to 8-year-olds, in part because if they got addicted to tobacco, it's not good for their health, but also because when people smoke, they devote attention to that project, right? They have to spend money on that project. They spend time on that project. It influences their life in complicated ways. And so if teaching kids certain habits is going to make it really hard for them to break those habits later if they want to, we see that as a problem. We see a lot of kids who aren't learning about plant-based eating. Like, they don't know what it looks like. They don't know what's fun and delicious and exciting and healthy about it. They don't see it as a way of enacting some values that they might hold dear. A lot of kids love animals, and I think they'd be really upset to know where some of their food comes from, and that's partly why parents don't necessarily tell their kids where their food comes from. And I think a lot of kids would value enacting their love for animals at the dinner table and elsewhere. Sometimes we do restrict people's choices to make it more possible for them to make their own choices over time. And obviously the cigarettes example, they're not exactly parallel. I'm not trying to say that the two cases are identical. But I do think that the framing helps us see, oh yeah, we don't give kids infinite options. We rule out some things because we don't think they're in a position to make an informed choice. We don't let kids operate heavy machinery. We don't let them get married when they're 6. We don't let them make major financial decisions for the family, things like that.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Rachel's saying. And the empirical data that we found is that most Americans are not prepared to switch over to a plant-based diet. Like, a lot of kids go to college and they maybe take an ethics class, or they consider vegetarianism for the first time. And the literature suggests that huge numbers of people are not prepared. They don't understand what would be involved in having a vegetarian diet. So a huge percentage of people who try vegetarianism, they try it for a few months, and then they're hungry. Maybe they really are malnourished. Iceberg lettuce and French fry diets and Oreos. And so we feel like we failed these people. And likewise with respect to older people in their 50s or 60s who have a heart attack, or they see a cardiologist. Cardiologists are generally trained to advise patients with heart disease to eat less meat. And there's a lot of literature showing that patients are unable to follow that advice. I mean, the doctor says it'll extend your life for years if you give up hamburgers, hot dogs, and steaks. And patients, they don't seriously consider it. So that's an autonomy issue. I mean, even a lot of patients who want to do it often don't know where to begin. So that's still the big picture. And it's about showing kids, exposing kids to different lifestyles when they're young. That's one part of it. And the second part is preventing kids from developing cognitive biases that often develop with carnist upbringings.
If I could say a little bit more on that last point
Yeah, absolutely.
about sort of these cognitive barriers, there's actually a huge literature. We can't possibly talk about all the elements of this literature here, but a great place to look is the literature on the meat paradox. A lot of people think that eating meat is normal and natural and necessary and nice, and yet if you ask them, they think that animals are poorly treated in factory farms and that animals have a right to be treated better and all these things. That creates a cognitive dissonance in people. They may not realize it, but when you're thinking of animals as something to be killed and not as something to be killed at the same time, that's actually hard on your brain. That kind of inconsistency. People do all sorts of mental backflips to deal with that paradox, and many of them involve kinds of reasoning that do not withstand scrutiny. So, for instance, if you ask people, if you do a survey and ask them whether food animals like cows and pigs and chickens, if they have minds, they're less likely to say that animals have minds if they're going to eat meat soon. Not just if they're going to eat meat, but if they're going to eat meat very soon in time, they're less likely to say that animals have minds. Now, whether animals have minds or not, I'm not even weighing in on that right now. But certainly the question isn't to be answered by how soon it will be before I put a certain item in my mouth. Right? That's not going to be the deciding factor. And we just find many, many, many of these cognitive barriers that get in the way of good reasoning about food, about animals, about consistency and moral principles. And we think that the literature shows pretty clearly that eating meat on a regular basis and other animal products makes it more likely for people to develop these mental gymnastics that aren't doing them any favors from a thinking well about their values perspective.
So if you want to be autonomous, we want to be able to think well about how to act. But we're basically kind of pushed into the world as meat eaters who then later find it hard to defend some of those practices. But then we're kind of stuck because we're already doing it, right? We've been given this habit and then we're asked to defend it and we can't, or we try to and it seems difficult. And then so we're trying to square the circle and say, well, how about this way? How about this way? And it must be the case. I've got to find a way of defending it. Rather than if we just brought into the world in a slightly more of a blank slate way, not being habitually eating meat, then I guess we can say, right, well, do I think it's justified to eat meat? If I do, I'll appeal to these reasons and get on with it. And if I don't, then I won't. But it's that's the kind of, in a way, the structural problem is that we're already eating meat before we try and defend it. We don't.
That's a concern that a lot of the literature, the social psychology literature backs up. And I really like how you put it, that some people are stuck, and we're raising a lot of children to be stuck in this way. And there are dozens of studies showing different aspects of the situation that makes them stuck. So two more have to do with taste preference formation and emotional attachments. There's a lot of literature in nutrition science showing that kids in their first 5 or 6 years develop taste preferences. And once those are formed, it can be quite difficult to change them. So it's important, there's a window of opportunity in the first decade of a person's life to set the baseline expectations and taste preferences, to train those on plant-based meals. When kids grow up, and if they want to incorporate animal products to those, that's feasible. But if kids grow up without habits that Rachel is describing, habits of, expecting plant-based meals and understanding how a full dinner can be plant-based, then it can be difficult to make that adjustment as an adult for taste preference reasons and also for emotional attachment reasons. It's like we're brought up on dad's burgers, grandma's chicken noodle soup, mom's grilled cheese. And once we have emotional attachments to these beloved animal product meals, it's really hard to break. I really sympathize with people who have strong emotional attachments to their family through these meat products, where the meat products take on this symbolic and emotional weight.
One reason people might struggle with the idea that being raised vegan would increase your autonomy is I think they might be thinking of eating meat as the norm that doesn't involve any ideology, where you don't have a view, right? You're just a person in the world eating normal food, doing normal things. And then to be vegan, to be brought up vegan, is to be pushed into a kind of ideology. And in your paper, you kind of touch on this idea that there's a kind of ideology around meat eating. We inhabit this world that does give us some ideology. Now maybe some vegans do end up creating something of an ideology when they're vegans who can't be reasoned with and who won't listen to what you're saying and so on and so forth, if you're providing them with a reasonable point of view about something. But can you develop this idea or talk about this idea that there might be an ideology behind eating meat?
Yeah, thank you for raising this. I think it's a key idea in the paper, which is that every person who's old enough to make choices makes choices about what to eat. It's not just vegans or people on a Mediterranean diet, or everyone does that. Whether it's just what you even count to be food in the first place.
Right,
There
yeah.
are things that are edible, right, that humans can digest and get calories and nutrients from that people in specific communities don't consider food. Most Americans do not count insects as food, but we certainly can digest them and get calories and nutrients from those things. Some of us don't consider those as food. That's a value commitment. That's a choice that most Americans are making, whether they eat hamburgers or not. So people are making these choices. It's appropriate to ask ourselves whether we're making the best choices for ourselves, or the choices that align with what we really think deep down, or however you want to phrase that. Everyone can think critically about their pattern of food choices, and maybe you feel that you can defend your choices exactly as they are. But many people, and ourselves included, we've made big food choices, changes over time. Many people will find at some time in their life that some of the choices and patterns that they're used to aren't really working for one reason or another. But they're all open to critical scrutiny by thoughtful people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and part of what we're advocating is for caregivers, including parents, but also school systems, to convey to kids just the sort of thing Rachel was saying, to communicate to kids that there are different lifestyles and different diets that are available, and to explain the reasons why different people choose different diets. And it's another thing that can trap people, undermine their ability to make decisions when they grow up. The ideology is not just tied to food, but it really extends to different parts of our identity. There's also notorious gender ideology, like real men have to eat hamburgers and only women eat salads. So these are things that are conveyed to kids, like all kinds of ads on TV convey this. Fast food ads show like real men eat hamburgers and things like that. So I think that's concerning from the perspective of a caregiver who wants to develop their kids' ability to make their own decisions when they grow up. I think we want caregivers to be careful also. Like, we don't need, we're not advocating that parents raise kids to think of themselves as vegans or as having any kind of ideology necessarily.
Right. Yeah.
We're happy if kids think of themselves as plant-based.
Yeah, exactly. There doesn't have to be an identity associated with veganism. Some people do certainly identify that way, and it's an important part of their life plans and self-understanding. But there are many people who eat plant-based food who just think this is what I eat. Either this is what I prefer, or this is what is healthy for me, or this is what my family has taught me to eat.
If I could just chime in, we're not assuming anything about whether the vegans are correct about the moral impermissibility of customary animal treatment. That's a whole separate issue that we're bracketing.
Yeah.
We're just saying, let's assume that meat eaters are right and it's okay, morally okay for them to eat meat as adults. And then even if we assume that, it's kind of surprising that there's still an open question about whether we should be giving kids those animal products as well.
Absolutely. So it's not a standard argument for plant-based eating. It's kind of a child's interest-centered argument. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Hi, just a really brief message to say, if you think this podcast should reach more people, then hitting follow would be so useful. So if you can, thank you so much. Great. And then before we get to some objections to your view, the final prong of the argument looks at moral development. So you say, if we raise kids to be meat eaters, we're unnecessarily exposing them to the risk of becoming prejudiced against other humans. And again, that's kind of surprising prong of the argument, because you might think, well, how would eating an animal make me prejudiced against humans, for example, women or racialized outgroups? So can you explain that side of the argument?
This part of the argument might be the most surprising for me. And it's based on 70 years or more of social psychology. It's this robust literature in social psychology about what some people call generalized prejudice, coming out of the work of Gordon Alpert. And there are all these studies showing that people who are prejudiced against Catholics, for example, also tend to be prejudiced against Jews. That's a very surprising finding from the 1950s, because Catholicism and Judaism are not the same thing. And Catholics and Jews are very distinct religious groups. So why would there be a correlation between anti-Catholic prejudice and anti-Jewish prejudice? And the 70 years of social psychology suggests that these kinds of prejudices go together as a kind of personality trait, sometimes called authoritarian personality trait, or there are other models for explaining this. And so we looked into the literature about people who are raised to think it's okay to eat animal products because animals are less important than human beings, roughly. So would the same thing hold? Would people who are raised to have what we might call an anti-animal prejudice also have anti-immigrant prejudice, or anti-black prejudice, or anti-woman prejudice? And so the surprising finding, especially in the last 20 years of research, is that those same tendencies show up in the context of the animal question. So right. Those findings from the 1950s and 60s, 70s, and 80s, very robust tradition, extends into this animal sphere. So, and again, this is independent of whether the vegans are right. It's independent of whether animals have moral rights. But the question is, if you teach people that it's okay to kill an animal and use them for your purposes, does that... So that introduces a kind of bias against those animals' interests. But does that bias bleed over into the human realm? And all of this literature suggests that it really does. So that was the most surprising for me.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, it's quite surprising, and there's more literature coming out about this. People are doing more research on this now, but we're already starting to see studies that show, not just correlation, but causation. That if you manipulate people in ways to enhance their anti-animal prejudice, you will see corresponding enhancement in their anti-human outgroup prejudice, whether it's immigrants or women or whatever group is considered an outgroup in that context. So we're not just saying that these two things run on parallel tracks, but we're starting to see evidence that there's causation. And that is particularly concerning when virtually every child in America is being taught some kind of species-based prejudice. Because virtually every child in America is being raised to eat the products of animals' bodies and reproductive capacities. And so we have a lot of people who very much do not want to raise kids who are prejudiced or in any way bigoted. We have whole, magazines and books and podcasts and things devoted to raising, anti-racist or whatever kind of non-prejudice thing you can think of. We devote a lot of attention, or many people devote a lot of attention to making sure that some of these prejudices aren't carried on in the next generation if we can help it. But that same attention is generally not being devoted to a core linchpin, which is the anti-animal sort of prejudice that, as Jeremy was saying, goes right hand in hand with these other kinds of anti-human prejudices.
And the studies you mentioned, they're things like giving someone a piece of text about human superiority and animals being inferior and unthinking or unfeeling, and then you ask them questions like, does this country have racialized minorities who are getting too aggressive in their demands for equal treatment? And the psychologists are finding that those who are fed the human-animal hierarchy literature then kind of were more ready to defend human hierarchy views, right?
Yeah, that is really surprising. And not just because what I would have intuitively assumed, but because it goes against centuries of developments in political philosophy. There's a humanist tradition in political philosophy going back to the Enlightenment or before, and really you can trace it to Aristotle, where, but in the last 3 centuries especially, there's this movement, and it's a hypothesis that, well, if we emphasize that humans are superior to animals, that human reason helps us transcend the animal sphere, that maybe that will help us to secure rights for all human beings. If we emphasize the specialness of humans, if we emphasize what sets humans apart from animals, then that will help us more universally protect human rights. It'll be good for all humans if we sharply distinguish all humans from all the other animals. That was the hypothesis. And many social movements draw on this hypothesis, and they'll say, like, I'm a human being. I'm not an animal, so I deserve social rights and democratic rights, political rights. So this is maybe the dominant hypothesis in political philosophy that social movements have drawn on for the last 3 centuries. But the research of the last 50 years, especially in social psychology, suggests that that humanist hypothesis is false. That actually, when you teach people to divide human beings from other animals, you're giving them a set of tools that they can use to attack other human beings as well. So you teach them, those individuals, they look like they suffer. those pigs, they look like they have preferences. They look like maybe they care about children, but actually don't worry because they're stupid. They don't think. It's unclear if they have minds. They're beasts. They don't have a well-developed sense of morality. So this is what we teach people about animals.
Yeah.
And the research suggests that teaching bleeds over into how we look at human outgroups. Oh, it looks like these human beings suffer. It looks like they have attachments to family. Looks like they have personal projects that they care about. But actually, they're just human animals. And this is the kind of rhetoric that we see in genocidal campaigns. It's notorious rhetoric, this supercharged speciesism, where the hypothesis was that's going to help human beings secure universal rights. But the supercharged speciesism is turned against human outgroups. That's really surprising.
Yeah, absolutely.
For so many reasons.
Yeah. Great, thanks. And I want to move on to some objections against your view. So one concerns the social burdens that might face kids who are raised on a plant-based diet. If other kids are eating meat and animal products, it might be hard for kids who are raised on a plant-based diet to interact with them, to go to parties with them, to celebrate with them, and so on.
I mean, I want to applaud any caregiver who has a genuine good faith concern about this, because it's a way of being genuinely concerned about kids, and that's great.
Yeah.
But there are a couple of things that we can say. The first one I'd like to say is that it is a lot easier to do what we're recommending if you're not doing it alone. And that's why we often try to focus on social level changes at least as much as individual level changes. But the more social support that people have, the more they have a kind of community to draw on in making these shifts, the easier it is, the more fun it is, just the better it is for everyone involved. Sometimes social support, all that means is just your neighbors don't ridicule you for making a different choice. They're at least just neutral. There are still going to be times when kids feel put on the spot because they're doing something different. Even if the kids around them aren't teasing them or anything, kids are sensitive to social difference, and so they might feel that, even if no one else around them cares or notices. But there are going to be times when kids around them notice and do comment on it or ask uncomfortable questions or tease or something. And that is an unfortunate reality. But like every other unfortunate reality about kids' upbringings, we want to encourage caregivers to take the time and make the effort to give kids the skills to deal with that. We would never encourage kids to, let's say, sexually objectify themselves just so they could fit in and avoid teasing. It wouldn't be worth it to ever do that. And we might take a similar tack here, that it is worth it to make this plant-based shift, even if there's some teasing or uncomfortableness that comes along with it. Those are opportunities to teach skills to kids that they need. Skills about how to talk about ways that they're different. Skills for dealing with their emotions when they're not attuned with their peers. These are things that all kids need, whether it's about food or any other thing going in their life. So we don't see these as insurmountable hurdles, but they are things that need to be addressed in a direct way and not shoved under the rug.
Great. And then a kind of maybe final objection to look at would be an objection concerning parental rights that you discussed. So I guess one way of putting this objection is that parenting is a balancing act between parents' interests and kids' interests. So no parent's going to be perfect, and parents can and do and must expose their kids to some risks. So a parent might think, I've got limited resources, I've got to look after myself as well, partly in order to be able to look after my kids, and partly because, I matter too and I have interests of my own. And so could you maybe explain why you think the risks are significant enough, the risks associated with giving kids a meat diet concerning moral development, autonomy and health, to make this something parents can't just set aside and go, you know what, I've got some autonomy to choose as a parent and to prioritise my own needs sometimes, and I'm not going to do this for those reasons?
Sure. It's an important question, and parents do have rights to be the ones to figure out what's in their kids' best interest. It's part of the parenting job, and because kids are so different and social circumstances, cultures are so different, parents do have rights to make certain judgments about like what their kids wear, what kinds of music their kids are allowed to listen to, what kinds of social activities kids can participate in. So we agree that parents have rights. What we try to do in the paper is to emphasize how important the three prongs are. Parents already care about their kids not being morally corrupted. Parents don't want to teach their kids, usually don't want to teach their kids to be prejudiced or to be liars. Parents already want that, and parents typically already want their kids to be healthy, or they should, and parents already want their kids to grow up to make decisions on their own, or at least many parents already want that. So we emphasize how serious it is to raise kids in a way that threatens to teach them prejudice against racialized outgroups, prejudice against women, in a way that all the social psychology, the surprising social psychology, suggests they may be doing by teaching them it's okay to treat animals in certain ways. One thing we want to emphasize is that a lot of, in the US at least, a lot of the food we're talking about, it's fast food or processed foods, there's not so much being lost in our proposal. There might be tough cases like Thanksgiving turkey that might have rich familial significance, rich cultural significance. One thing we want to emphasize to parents is that it's easy to go a long way in the direction that we're proposing, like by modifying school meals, without losing cultural treasures. And the benefits to kids would be pretty immense. Mm. So that's the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when we do turn to things that are kind of cultural treasures, food-related cultural treasures, cultures are not static, and there are already tons of veganized versions of many, many cultural treasures in all sorts of cultures. Of course, many cultures have histories going back where plant-based dishes were already cultural treasures, right? For generations upon generations.
I think one aspect of my question is probably touching on the question of whether parents need to be vegan themselves for your arguments, for the benefits that your argument highlights to be secured for kids.
There are different approaches that could work. We already have traditions about what to say to kids with alcohol. So why do the parents get to have beer at the table and kids don't? Like when I was a kid, I remember in the 1980s, going back to the example of smoking, there was a anti-secondhand smoke campaign in my school. And our teacher gave us a sticker to give to our parents if they're smoking. My best friend Eric, his mom is a chain smoker and she would smoke in the house. So I remember going to Eric's house after class, and he gave the sticker to his mom and laid it on pretty thick. And he was like, "Mom, would you not smoke indoors when I'm there? Because," and then he repeated all the things that were taught that day. Yeah. Secondhand smoke is quite dangerous. And then she scoffed, took the sticker and threw it in the trash. She was like, I have the right to smoke cigarettes. My child can't tell me what to do. And that was a really common reaction among a lot of smokers in the 80s. But that's changed. And so you could ask the same question you just asked us about smoking. Like, do parents need to never smoke? Or just not smoke in the house with the kids, not smoke in the car? And there can be different accommodations that could work. I mean, parents have the right to smoke cigarettes. Adults have that right. Maybe smoke outside. That sends its own message. But we don't want to dictate to parents in this paper what they should do, so long as they take a thoughtful approach with what they're conveying to their kids.
And actually, we have a friend whose friends, they were all having a conversation about what's it going to be like raising this kid. It was, the first kid in the family, and what decisions do we make? And we're changing our schedule. We're doing this. We're doing all these things to try to make a good life for this brand new baby. And our friend said, "Oh, that's so interesting. My friends just wrote an article about food choices for kids. Do you want to read it?" They read it, and they are actually raising their baby as a vegan. And I never, ever thought that something like that could come from this article. And to me, that's the most surprising thing, that it actually found an audience of two people.
Great.
Yeah, I expected at least a decade of people crumpling it up and throwing it in the trash like Eric's mom. But yeah, and I'm not sure if these friends of our friend are themselves going vegan. To Will's question,
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
Great. And then one more question, really, just we might get a bit practical and talk about some concrete advice for parents who might be interested in this, both in general, but also about the educational component that we haven't really discussed. So in the paper, you say that we should be giving kids some appropriate education about why people choose to be vegan, but also why people choose not to be vegan. And maybe you can touch on that advice and whether you intend this to be kind of neutral advice, purely factual, or whether you think that it's not really possible to be neutral or not desirable.
My first suggestion would be, if you don't already have any, make a vegan friend. Friends are great. And having a friend who knows something, has some experience, maybe would delight in sharing some of their favorite dishes with you, maybe would delight in a shared meal, could help take some of the pressure off. Making it a social thing is just so much more likely to work. And as I said, friends are great in their own right. And if you can't find someone to be your vegan friend, find somebody who's willing to go on a vegan adventure with you, right? Maybe you're not going to be vegan, but you're going to try a new restaurant or a new dish at a restaurant every once in a while. Or maybe you're going to do a shared meal that you cook together every once in a while and see if you like what you come up with. So my first, most practical advice is, like, don't try to do it by yourself. Find a vegan or veganish friend. That could be me if you emailed me.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I'd also add that there are some good parenting books written by actual nutritionists about how to raise your baby as a vegan and what foods to introduce to them at 6 months, and different tips about what these nutritionists have found works.
And was there a book in particular that you recommend, or just...
I'll get it from the bookshelf if you could just give me a minute. Okay, one book I'd recommend is called The Plant-Based Baby and Toddler. And the authors are Whitney English and Alexandra Caspero.
Great.
They are both dietitian nutritionists, certified. They do this for their jobs, and it's a beautiful book. And I think there are a dozen more kind of like it. So my library had this one, and it's nice to compare the different strategies and get ideas from other people who've done the hard work of researching what kids like and reading all this massive amount of nutrition literature.
All right, it's time for the Put It to the Parents segment. So in the virtual room for that conversation were 6 parents, each with their own little ones and their futures to consider. So let's see what they made of that, starting with Paul, a father of 2 based in London.
I think it's definitely possible to have a plant diet for your children in your own home, but I think it's very difficult, near on impossible, to have outside of the house, just because we're not in a society that's really built around it. We don't have Elsa on the side of like a pack of sliced mangoes, and kids are gonna want things that they're excited about, and we're just not making plant-based alternatives too exciting for kids. And also we've got to remember that kids have their own autonomy, and they can be so fussy, and as a parent you get a bit exasperated with trying to give them things and they just won't go for it, and so you might end up having to give them things that you might not always want to, but just so that they eat.
I was raised by a father who'd grown up with post-war rationing still in place.
And this is James, a new father of 1.
And so there was a real scarcity of and value placed on calorie-dense, nutrient-rich foods like animal products, which obviously shaped his palate and the palate that he then raised me on too. So I do think it's important to certainly have a more plant-based diet. I do think that in the arguments, the characterization of what it means to eat an omnivorous diet was perhaps slightly selective. I don't think it reflected quite as much on things like inclusion of lean meats or oily fish or eggs and some dairy products, which I think can form part of a balanced, healthy diet. I could certainly agree with the predominantly plant-based diet, but I think there are a number of barriers to a maximalist approach. The advice that we've seen from both paediatricians and from nutritionists has stressed that a plant-based diet is certainly feasible for infants, but needs a high degree of planning to ensure that they're getting the right mix of nutrients, or that they're eating fortified foods or are supplementing. How much is it reasonable to expect parents to do? And children can go through phases of, for instance, only wanting to drink cow's milk, or only eating a specific food type for certain meals of the day, which I think can make it extremely challenging for parents to give the kind of variety required in their diet.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I am a mother of 2. I have a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old. It's been a really easy choice for me to want to give my children a vegetarian diet, and wait until an age where they can understand about eating meat, and that it is eating animals, and that it is often, that animals are killed under such cruel conditions. And I would like them to understand that before they choose whether to be a meat eater or not. And I think that'll probably be when they're sort of a teenager. And I'm happy to have that chat with them. But until then, I feel that it's really important for my own ethics to make sure that they are a vegetarian first and foremost. And this has been interesting because my partner is a meat eater, but he's also happy with that decision. And I think this is a really important conversation, and I'd be really interested to hear about other people's thoughts on it. I suppose the other thing is just wanting to make sure that children have a really good relationship to eating and food, and that they enjoy it, and that it's a social activity, and that there's no bad foods. I think that's quite an important thing that I've learned, and not necessarily doing that thing of like, you can't have your pudding unless you've eaten your dinner, because everything's kind of got equal weighting, and just ensuring that enjoyment is at the heart of eating for them.
Now for the view of Jake and Claire.
We have an 18-month-old who we have weaned omnivorously, and I'm kind of quite sympathetic to a lot of what has been said in the discussion. I think one of the big sticking points, one of the big challenges in making kind of a decision effectively on behalf of another person is sort of the lack of information around the costs and benefits of feeding a plant-based diet to a very small child, not even a kind of older child. And so I kind of felt that didn't always come across in the discussion. I don't think, for instance, that because I had an omnivorous diet growing up, it was therefore nutritionally excellent, and I'm like really open to the idea that it was deficient in various ways, and that there may be plant-based diets that are superior in various ways, and perhaps all the relevant ways. I guess the challenge is finding reliable information to that effect. And I actually think that would be like a really useful piece of work, would be to kind of advise on the nutritional kind of costs and benefits of these different diets with small children.
And finally, David, a Danish father of two.
I don't think it's obviously impermissible to kill and eat animals who have led decent lives of an appropriate length. I don't think consuming animal products like eggs and milk necessarily involves animal suffering either. But of course, we don't live in a world in which animals lead decent lives. We live in a world in which eating meat is likely to mean participating in the lifelong torture of factory farmed animals. In that world, we should certainly raise our children to not eat meat and teach them about the excellent plant-based alternatives that exist. I'm skeptical about the idea that we need to ground this argument against raising our children to be meat eaters in the interests of the child. The straightforward reason is that we should raise our children to not eat meat to prevent harm to animals, to help prevent the lifelong torture of creatures that experience grief, pain, and fear. Just like we should raise our sons not to be misogynists for the sake of the women that they'll encounter and for the men they can influence. Not, in the first instance, for their own sake.
Right, that's it. Thank you so much for tuning in to Surprising Ethics with me, Will. The survey in the description remains open so that I can have an ongoing conversation with wonderful listeners like you about what you want improved in this podcast. And thanks so much to those who've given me feedback. And come back for future episodes on topics including whether men are being harmed by the manosphere, even when they get what they set out to achieve. See you soon for more Surprising Ethics.